I always loved taking late-night walks in the park. There was something serene about it. The stillness, the cool night air, the way the lamplights cast long shadows across the pavement. It was my escape from the noise of the world, my time to clear my head. But one night, that peaceful ritual turned into something else. Something terrifying. It was around 10:30 p.m. when I decided to go for a walk in Lincoln Park. The city had been overwhelming that day, and I needed fresh air. The park wasn't empty. There were a few joggers making their way down the paved paths, the rhythmic sound of their sneakers tapping against the ground. A couple sat on a bench beneath the glow of a street lamp, engaged in a quiet conversation, their murmurs barely audible over the occasional rustle of leaves. In the distance, a man walked his dog, the soft jingling of the leash blending into the ambient night sounds. I slipped in my earbuds, listening to a true crime podcast as I strolled past the meticulously maintained flower beds, their colors dulled under the yellowish hue of the streetlights. Towering oak trees lined the path, their branches swaying gently in the night breeze, casting long, twisting shadows across the pavement. The lake at the far end of the park shimmered faintly under the moonlight, a serene backdrop to an otherwise peaceful night. The air carried the scent of damp earth and freshly cut grass, grounding me in the familiarity of my routine. But tonight felt different, off. I noticed a man walking a little ahead of me. He was dressed in dark clothing, jeans, a hoodie, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. At first, I didn't pay him much attention. People walked in parks all the time. But as I kept walking, something started to gnaw at me. He was slowing down, matching my pace. The path ahead curved slightly to the left, leading toward a dimly lit area near a row of park benches. The further we walked, the more the bustling activity of the park faded behind me, leaving only the sound of my own footsteps and his. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. Maybe he was just enjoying the night air like me. But then, as I veered onto a different path that cut through a wooded section of the park, he did the same. I turned my head slightly, using my peripheral vision to glance at him. He wasn't looking at his phone, wasn't listening to music. He was watching me. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I took a deep breath and sped up, forcing my steps to be casual, not rushed. The gravel crunched beneath my sneakers as I neared a clearing with a fountain in the middle. Then I heard it. Footsteps, behind me. I turned my head slightly again. He was closer now, not running, but too close. I glanced ahead. There were people near the fountain. If I could just get there, I'd be safe. I quickened my pace. The footsteps behind me did too. I was being followed. Every instinct screamed at me to stay calm, not to panic. I reached into my pocket, gripping my phone tightly. My heart pounded as I pressed the emergency dial button, keeping my thumb over the call icon. Then, just as I neared the fountain, I stopped abruptly and turned around. So did he. Our eyes met. His expression was blank, unreadable, but there was something in the way he didn't react that made my stomach twist. No surprise, no embarrassment, just stillness. I wasn't overreacting. He was following me. My brain was moving too fast, scanning my options. Running could escalate things. Confronting him could be dangerous. Instead, I walked toward the fountain and sat on a bench near a group of people, pretending to check my phone. I expected him to keep walking, to leave me alone. But he didn't. Instead, he stood just beyond the circle of light, lingering in the shadows, watching me. I typed out a text. There's a guy following me in the park. If I stop responding, call the police. I sent it to my roommate. She replied instantly. Where are you? I set my location and tried to act normal, my fingers trembling over the screen. The man still hadn't moved. I decided to test him. Standing up, I made my way toward the park exit, deliberately walking past a security camera near the entrance. If he followed, I'd have proof. I walked with purpose, my heart hammering against my ribs. I counted my steps. 1, 2, 3. I heard his footsteps behind me. I reached the street. The glow of a convenience store sign flickered in the distance. I knew I had two choices, either enter a store with people inside or try to outrun him. I chose the store. As I pushed open the glass door of the convenience store, I glanced behind me. He had stopped. He stood just outside watching, his face still unreadable. The bright lights of the store cast his features in sharp relief. He was older than I thought, maybe mid-40s. His hoodie was slightly oversized, his hands stuffed into the pockets. He wasn't buying anything. He wasn't meeting anyone. He had followed me here. The cashier, a guy in his 20s, looked up from his phone. "You okay?" I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I think someone's following me." The cashier's expression hardened. He turned his gaze to the man outside. "Stay here," he said, stepping out from behind the counter. I watched as he walked toward the door. The man outside saw him coming and finally moved. Without a word, he turned and disappeared down the street. I stayed in the convenience store for another 20 minutes, making sure he was truly gone. The cashier offered to call the police, but I knew they wouldn't be able to do much. He hadn't done anything, but he had followed me. That was enough. When I finally got home, I locked my door twice, and from that night on, I never walked alone in the park again. It was past midnight on an autumn night in 2023 when I left my apartment for a walk. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain from earlier that evening. My neighborhood wasn't dangerous, but it was eerily quiet at that hour. The occasional rustling of fallen leaves accompanied my footsteps, adding a rhythmic sound to the stillness of the night. Streetlights buzzed softly, casting elongated shadows on the cracked sidewalk. The houses along the street stood dark and silent, their curtains drawn, their porches empty. A few porch lights flickered, illuminating empty driveways, and the occasional forgotten bicycle leaned against a fence. Every now and then, a dog barked in the distance before the silence returned. I turned onto a side street lined with a mix of old brick buildings and newer apartment complexes. Some of the storefronts had their security gates pulled down, their neon signs turned off. A 24-hour laundromat still had its lights on, its rows of machines spinning clothes inside. Further down, a small corner store had a single dim light above its entrance, the open sign still glowing faintly. The smell of damp asphalt lingered in the air as I continued along my usual route, a few blocks through residential streets before looping back through this strip of small businesses. As I crossed into a parking lot behind an old convenience store, I saw them. A group of young men, 4 or 5 of them, clustered around a parked sedan. They looked to be in their late teens or early 20s, dressed in dark hoodies and jeans, their faces partially obscured by their clothing. One of them leaned against a nearby lamppost, scanning the street with sharp, alert eyes. His posture was tense, his hands deep in his hoodie pockets as he shifted restlessly from foot to foot. He wasn't just waiting, he was watching for something. 2 others stood near the car, positioned in a way that suggested they were trying to block the view from anyone passing by. One of them had his back to me, but the other, a lanky guy with a beanie pulled low over his forehead, kept glancing around nervously. Then I noticed the 4th guy, crouched low near the driver's side door. He had a thin metal tool in his hand, working quickly at the lock. The way his fingers moved with precision, the way the others shielded him, it wasn't casual. It was deliberate. They weren't just hanging out, they were stealing that car. My breath hitched. I had stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see. My breath caught in my throat. I was about 20 yards away, half hidden by the shadow of a dumpster. If I hadn't stopped, I might have walked straight past them. I should have turned around right then, walked away, pretended I hadn't seen anything. But instead, I hesitated, and that's when one of them saw me. He was tall, wearing a black hoodie with the hood pulled up. His face was partially obscured by the dim light, but his eyes, sharp, dark, and filled with something unreadable, locked onto mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, he said something under his breath to the others. They all turned to look at me. Panic surged through me. My mind raced. What do I do? Running would make me look guilty, but standing there felt like an equally bad idea. So I did the only thing I could think of. I nodded slightly, as if acknowledging them, then turned casually as if I hadn't seen anything important. I forced myself to walk, not run, back toward the street. Footsteps. At first I wasn't sure. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I was being paranoid. Then I heard them again. Multiple sets of footsteps. They weren't running, but they were moving quickly, following me. I kept walking, my heart hammering against my ribs. My apartment was still 6 blocks away, too far. My phone was in my pocket, but pulling it out and making a call would signal that I was scared. That might make things worse. I spotted a small diner up ahead, its neon sign flickering, casting a faint red glow on the sidewalk. It was the only business still open at this hour, the smell of frying bacon and coffee drifting through the air. Without breaking stride, I turned sharply and headed straight for it. The moment I stepped inside, the doorbell jingled. A middle-aged waitress stood behind the counter, wiping down the surface. An older man in a trucker's cap sat in the corner, sipping coffee. The place was quiet but not empty. The waitress looked up. "Hon, you all right?" she asked, glancing toward the door. I turned, glancing outside. The men had stopped at the curb. They weren't coming in, but they were watching. I slid into a booth, pretending to check my phone while my mind raced. How long could I stay here? I couldn't just sit in the diner all night. The waitress approached. "You sure you're okay?" I hesitated, then nodded toward the men outside. I think they were following me. Her eyes narrowed. "You want me to call someone?" That's when I realized something. I hadn't actually seen them commit a crime. They hadn't threatened me. If I called the police and they left before officers arrived, I'd look paranoid at best. But if I walked back out there, I wasn't sure what would happen. As I weighed my options, the men exchanged glances. Then, just as suddenly as they had followed me, they turned and walked away. Just like that. No confrontation, no words, just the quiet sound of their retreating footsteps into the night. But then I saw what made them leave. A patrol car pulled into the diner's parking lot, its headlights sweeping across the pavement. The officer inside wasn't looking for anyone in particular, just stopping for a late-night meal. He stepped out, adjusting his belt, and walked inside, nodding at the waitress as he approached the counter to order coffee and a sandwich. The men outside didn't wait around to see if he had noticed them. One by one, they turned and disappeared down the street, their postures tense, their movements hurried. It was clear they didn't want to take any chances. I let out a slow breath, my hands still trembling slightly. I had been lucky. If the officer hadn't shown up when he did, I wasn't sure how things would have played out. I didn't leave immediately. I stayed in the diner for another 20 minutes, keeping a cautious eye on the door. When I finally stepped outside, the sidewalk was empty. The patrol car still parked nearby. As I walked home, my mind replayed everything that had happened. That night, I learned a valuable lesson. It wasn't just about being aware of my surroundings. It was about trusting my instincts. Next time, I wouldn't take a deserted path, and I certainly wouldn't hesitate if something felt off. I walked home fast, checking over my shoulder the entire way, silently grateful to the officer who had unknowingly come to my rescue. I never saw them again. Never heard about a stolen car in the neighborhood, never found out who they were. But I knew what I had seen. And I knew one thing for sure, I was lucky. If I had walked just a little closer, if I had reacted differently, if they had decided I was a real threat instead of just some guy on a walk, I might not have made it home at all. From that night on, I never took another late-night walk alone. I've always enjoyed walking my dog Toby late at night. The quiet streets, the distant hum of the city, the crisp night air, it was my way of unwinding after a long day. But one night changed everything, and now I can't walk alone without feeling that same suffocating fear creeping up my spine. It was a Friday night, a little after 10 p.m. The neighborhood was mostly silent, the occasional porch light flickering, a car driving by every now and then. I had lived here for 2 years, and it always felt safe. Toby, my golden retriever, was excited as always. He loved our nighttime walks, his tail wagging as we made our way down the familiar streets. The leash was loose in my grip, and I let him lead the way as we strolled past rows of suburban homes. I had my earbuds in, but kept the volume low enough to stay aware of my surroundings. One thing my mom always taught me was to never let my guard down completely, no matter how safe a place felt. Tonight felt different, though. Toby was acting strange. About 10 minutes into our walk, Toby suddenly stopped. His ears perked up, his body tensed, and he let out a low, guttural growl, something he almost never did. I stopped, my heart skipping a beat. I glanced around but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just quiet houses and parked cars. "Toby, what is it?" I whispered, kneeling next to him. He didn't respond, just kept staring into the darkness near a cluster of trees at the edge of the street. His hackles were raised, his stance stiff. I followed his gaze, squinting into the darkness. Nothing, but my stomach churned with unease. Maybe a raccoon, I told myself, or another dog in a backyard. Still, I decided to pick up the pace. A few blocks later, Toby was still tense, his ears flicking in all directions. Normally, he was relaxed, sniffing everything in sight. But tonight, he barely stopped, his movements rigid, purposeful. That's when I felt it, that creeping sensation, like someone's eyes were on me. I glanced over my shoulder. No one. I turned back and kept walking, trying to shake the feeling. But then I heard it. A soft crunch of gravel behind me. I froze. Toby let out another growl, his body lowering like he was ready to pounce. I turned sharply. The street was empty. The parked cars cast long shadows under the dim glow of the streetlights. I swallowed hard. Maybe I was imagining it. Still, I kept my hand on my phone, my heart pounding in my chest. We turned a corner, heading toward home. I forced myself to relax, brushing off my paranoia. But just as I was starting to breathe again, I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine, not Toby's, someone else's. I stopped abruptly. The sound stopped too. I turned so fast that my vision blurred. No one was there. Toby growled again, low and deep. That's when I saw it, a shadow shifting between the parked cars about 30 feet behind me. Someone was there, and they were following us. I didn't think, I just moved. "Toby, let's go." I broke into a brisk walk, then a jog. Toby kept pace, but his head was still turned slightly, ears pinned back. I could hear the footsteps behind me now, faster, closing the gap. My apartment was still 2 blocks away. I ran. Toby ran. The footsteps behind us quickened. I darted between 2 houses, cutting through a backyard. My breath came in short gasps. I didn't care if someone saw me running through their lawn. I just needed to get away. I reached the next street, my legs burning. I risked a glance back. The figure had stopped. A dark shape stood at the edge of the street, just beyond the glow of the streetlights. They didn't chase me further. They just stood there, watching. I burst into my apartment, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I gripped my phone, ready to call someone, but who? I peered out the window. Nothing. The street was empty. Normal. Like nothing had happened. Toby was still tense, staring at the door. I never saw that figure again. But for weeks after, I felt it, that same creeping sensation whenever I walked Toby, like someone was watching, waiting. Now I don't go out alone at night anymore, and neither does Toby. It was a Tuesday evening in late September. The air had that crisp autumn bite, cool but not too cold. I had finished dinner, grabbed my jacket, and stepped outside for my usual walk around the neighborhood. I lived in a relatively quiet suburban area just outside of Chicago, mostly residential, tree-lined streets with the occasional corner store or diner. Most houses had their lights on, curtains drawn, and I could hear the faint sound of TVs playing behind closed doors. It felt safe, familiar. I took my usual route, heading down a well-lit sidewalk past a row of parked cars. Streetlights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows on the pavement. Then I noticed something odd. A black SUV was parked on the opposite side of the street. The engine was off, no headlights on. At first, I didn't think much of it. People parked all the time. But as I walked past, I felt something, a prickle of unease at the back of my neck. I glanced over my shoulder. The SUV was still there, but I could barely make out the shape of someone inside. Just a shadow sitting in the driver's seat, unmoving. I shook off the feeling and kept walking. I turned onto another street, heading toward the small park I usually passed through. There was a single bench near a lamppost where I liked to stop for a few minutes just to sit and breathe in the night air. As I reached the bench, I hesitated. The same black SUV was now parked at the end of the street. I hadn't heard it start, hadn't heard an engine, but it was there, facing my direction, like whoever was inside was watching. My heartbeat quickened. Coincidence? Maybe, but it didn't feel like it. I pulled out my phone and pretended to check something, just to look casual. The screen lit up. No new messages, no notifications. I glanced at the SUV again. The shadow in the driver's seat was still there. That was enough for me. I turned back the way I came, picking up my pace, my breath coming a little faster now. Halfway home, I heard them. Footsteps. Not the echo of my own, someone else's. I didn't turn around right away. I told myself it was nothing, just someone out for a walk, like me. But then I listened closer. Whoever it was, they were keeping pace with me. When I sped up, so did they. When I slowed, so did they. My stomach twisted into a knot. I forced myself to stay calm. Don't panic, just get home. I took a sharp left onto a side street, a detour I never usually took, but one that would get me back to my apartment faster. I listened. The footsteps followed. That was it. I broke into a run. I sprinted, my heart hammering, my breath sharp in the cold air. The houses blurred past me. I could hear the footsteps behind me, faster now, closing the distance. I turned another corner, almost slipping as my sneakers hit the pavement. My building was just a block away. Then, a voice, "Stop!" No way in hell. I ran faster, lungs burning. The footsteps were right behind me now. I could hear the heavy breathing of whoever was chasing me. I reached my apartment building, fumbling for my keys. My hands shook as I jammed the key into the lock, yanking the door open just as the footsteps reached the sidewalk outside. I slammed the door shut and locked it. Through the glass, I saw a man standing there. He was dressed in dark clothing, breathing hard, his face hidden by the shadow of his hoodie. He didn't try to open the door, he just stood there, watching. Then, slowly, he backed up and walked away. I stayed inside for the rest of the night, barely able to sleep. Every sound made me jump. I kept replaying everything in my head. The SUV, the footsteps, the way he chased me but never spoke, never tried to grab me. The next morning, I checked outside. The SUV was gone. I never saw it again, never saw the man again. But from that night on, I stopped taking walks alone, because sometimes someone might be following, and next time they might not let you get away.